Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Saurabh Kumar from Ancillary Services Limited. Very warm welcome to everyone who has joined us, will be joining us over the next 1 hour. It's a great privilege for me to welcome two leading energy and energy efficiency experts of the world, Dr. Stephen Fox, who has more than 30 years of experience in energy efficiency financing, and has been an expert not just for UK but virtually all across the world, having been writing books and publications, more than 250 of them over his very long, illustrious career. Welcome, Steve, to this conversation.
Thank you. So good to be here.
I also have Hugh Richmond, who is the Chief Executive Officer of ADENA. ADENA is a joint venture between EESL and Energy Pro Limited, which is founded by Dr. Stephen Fox. Hugh has more than 25 years of experience in gas engines, the entire gas ecosystem, and has worked virtually throughout the world, including Africa, Asia, and so on and so forth. So welcome you to this conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay. Can I request Soumya to please put up the presentation that I would like to just start off this conversation. So very quickly, what are we discussing today? And it's a slightly technical topic, but the experts will try and make it explain it in a manner that all of us would understand. And there are certain basic bullets that you see on your screen right now. India is among the fastest growing renewable energy market in the world. We have already committed to do 175 gigawatts by 2022, which will rise to 500 gigawatts by 2030. Now, all of us know that renewable energy is a power which is intermittent. It is not a fixed power, and even the best of forecasting could lead up to a 5% error. So what this bullet is trying to see, that if we have 250 to 300 gigawatts of renewable energy connected to the grid, a 5% error could be as high as an up and down of generation by 12 to 15 megawatts. We've also seen various nations, and again, Hugh and Steve would help us decipher this. Wherever there is a renewable energy ingress in the grid of 18 to 20%, you need a separate mechanism to balance, and I'll tell you in a minute what that means for us. Can you go to the next slide, please, which is my last slide before I invite the two experts. Now, if you see what is happening, and I'll take you through what happened on the 5th of April 2020, when the Honorable Prime Minister of India gave a call that all of us come out at 9 p.m., switch off the lights, and exactly at 9:09 switch it on. What happened there was, if you see the scale which is tilting, at 9 o'clock, the demand suddenly fell by 15,000 megawatt instantaneously. And therefore, on this scale, if there's nothing else that will happen, you will suddenly see that the scale going topsy-turvy. Similarly, at 9:09, instantaneously, the demand went back by about 12 to 13,000 megawatts. And therefore, you need balancing, what is called balancing power. How was the grid managed? There are only two technologies which are commercial, which can instantaneously ramp up, as it is called, which means that you push 15,000 megawatt of energy almost in a millisecond, or you absorb that 15,000 megawatt in that millisecond. So hydropower stations were used. All these hydropower stations are presently supplying power to a host of other states. But during this event, to manage this event, these hydropower stations of 15,000 megawatt were taken out from the power market, which means if they were supplying power to UP or to West Bengal, for those 3 or 4 hours, they were not allowed to supply. The system operator took them over. The moment at 9 p.m. the load went down, the hydro power stations were immediately, the load was reduced by 15,000 megawatts. And when it came back at 9:09, they were immediately ramped up. Now, this was possible because there was time for preparation, because the event was pre-planned. As I mentioned earlier, when we reach 250, 300 gigawatts of renewable energy, a 5% error could lead to a very similar event, and you may not have enough time to plan. And that's why the balancing is so very important, because if the scale goes topsy-turvy, the entire grid can collapse. And therefore, what is needed in the country moving forward is an ancillary service or a balancing market, something that UK has, and so has many other countries. So with this background, I would like to bring in Dr. Stephen Fox, that given that possibly India saw the first very big event where the supply and the demand both fell at an incredibly fast pace. What are the lessons that we could learn from UK? How do you see, what should the Indian policymakers do so as to deal with these situations? Steve.
Sure, thanks. Thanks for the introduction and setting the context there. I think it's important to say, UK, as all countries, are on this journey, this energy transition journey, and we need to just look at where we are now on that journey to start with. And our renewables industry and the use of renewables has grown incredibly. It started really in the late 1990s, where there were maybe a few dozen people talking about building very small wind farms. And so there was hardly any wind and almost zero solar capacity. But at the end of 2019, we had about 40 gigawatts of renewables, excluding hydro, so probably about 50% of the capacity. And in 2018, 21% of the power came from renewables, wind and solar particularly. So we are seeing these very high levels of penetration of renewables, and that is causing the issues that you referred to about balancing and the need for more ancillary services, how to balance the grid. Interestingly enough, we've also gone from a level of carbon intensity on the grid north of 400 grams a kilowatt hour of CO2, grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, down to about 50. And in fact, last weekend, we actually hit a new low of about 13 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is kind of where we thought it'd be in 2030. So we've had this rapid decarbonization, rapid growth of wind and solar. And that's led to this growth in the market for ancillary services, which are about between 5 and 10% of the total value of the market. And then, of course, in the last few months, we've had the coronavirus lockdown, and that in itself has caused a big impact because clearly, like all countries, our demand has gone down, something between 10 and 20% reduction in demand. We happen to have had some pretty long periods of sunny weather and quite a lot of wind and different days. And so we've had even a higher percentage of renewable generation, and that's led to extra pressure on the national grid to balance the service. So these balancing services, ancillary services, have become more important. And we've had to innovate on the hoof, really. So National Grid introduced a new kind of ancillary service just to deal with these problems over the last few weeks. So we've had this market-driven approach, very entrepreneurial. Companies can start up and create and provide these services, and it's grown rapidly and with a lot of innovation. So I think that's the background to the UK.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think the key point that I take out from this is that a decarbonization, which I think most countries have committed to, has its challenges, and perhaps ancillary service market, as of now, seems to be the only answer, and the UK model very clearly suggests. Furthermore, in times of pandemic that we all are going through, whether there is further suppression of demand, you then need to innovate further into the market to make sure that the grid stability is maintained. And I think that's one lesson that perhaps India can take in its endeavor to decarbonize. Let me at this stage bring in Hugh Richmond. Hugh, you are running one of the largest gas engine companies in the UK. And what has been your experience, particularly in the short-term operating reserve, which is the store market, and how do you think this market will evolve, given what Steve just now said about decarbonization and the fact that more and more wind and solar will come into the system?
Yes. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. This first came to light for me personally and within the company way back in 2014 and 15 when we started to be asked to provide potential power facilities for this short-term operational reserve, a peaking market. And it caught us all a bit unawares because we normally just sell gas power engines into industry and hospitals, etc., and the normal market. So this certainly became a new market for us. And as I say, this goes back to 2014 and 2015. Since then, it's been the mainstay of certainly my company in the UK's focus is to build these, power plants, normally connecting at 11,000 kV all over the country. So it's a very decentralized power solution. So typically I would be building 10 meg here, 20 meg there, 10 meg over there. So you just basically build a lot of plants. We now operate around 350, 360 megawatts of power and around about 35, 36 sites around the UK. And it's growing, and it's a real need. Now, my focus is very much as an auxiliary service is a gas solution. Now, it cannot all be taken up by gas solutions because typically a gas engine will take 2 to 5 minutes to ramp up to full load. So if there's any variations in the grid network that happens relatively quickly, gas engines do not react that quickly. So we originally thought this back in 2014-15 as being very much a diesel-driven, solution. But then diesel is one of those fuels that, from an emissions point of view and a cleanliness point of view, it's kind of a no-no. So gas is the clear option. But obviously, for the fast, ultra-fast reactions, your hydrogen still plays a part. Your batteries still play a part. So you're starting to see now. Even I'm looking at this where we have a gas and battery combined or a gas and solar combined, and you get more of these hybrid systems. And the market is evolving very, very quickly to deal with this issue.
Thank you. I think you've raised a number of very, very important issues that we will probably take this conversation forward. And 2-3 issues which you have raised is the need for different kinds of ancillary services based on the requirement of the grid. if something like the 5th April event happens and instantaneous load fall happens, the only answer is hydro or batteries, while gas may take about 6, 7, 8, or maybe 10 minutes to ramp up. You've also touched upon a very important topic which we will take up is centralized versus decentralized. I mean, how those technically these ancillary services being placed, should it be one central place or decentralized? So let me turn to Hugh. I mean, sorry, to Steve. Steve, you have been working across the globe on these matters. So could you just tell us and tell our viewers, and let me also tell you that we have almost 400 people live at this point in time on Twitter, and we hope more will join. Just if you can just explain what Hugh just mentioned about the use of the different technologies like batteries and gas stations, and what is it that when is it required?
Sure. I think, as you said, and it is happening everywhere, this sort of mega trend towards decentralization. You know, we often talk about the three big trends being decarbonization, decentralization, and digitization, and they're all happening. And you know, as an example, here in the UK, we have pushing now 1 million generating sites if you count everybody's resident rooftops, and that's unimaginable compared to what it was a few years ago, where you just had a limited number of big centralized plants. So you've got this decentralization, balancing, moving also from the transmission system to the distribution company and becoming very localized. So you do need localized solutions. And then, as you said, there are different types of ancillary services depending on the speed of response, frequency response having to be practically instantaneous and very quick, load and operating reserve not so quick. So you have these different technologies, everything from demand response, switching things off, which is valuable and can be done intelligently without affecting service levels. You have batteries, which of course are growing rapidly because the price of batteries is coming down. And I think we're seeing more and more battery systems everywhere, and battery systems that can be located decentralized wherever there's a specific issue in the grid. And then gas engines, and then increasingly even now renewables, which we sort of thought weren't really able to play in this market. Now with intelligent systems, they can actually start to play in the market. And then I think the other big trend that everybody should bear in mind is this move from people just consumers of energy, electricity, whether they're industry, commerce, buildings, or individual householders. So traditionally, we were just consumers, and you had a meter, and you just took what you were given or what you needed, to becoming both consumers and producers. There's this word, which is the buzzword about prosumers, which is an old word coined in the 70s by Alvin Toffler, a great futurist, where you both produce and consume. And so you're seeing that more and more because companies are using their existing energy assets, like a CHP plant, or putting in new assets like batteries to be able to sell these ancillary services to the grid. And so what's happening is, where you used to have that very rigid border between here's the producer and here's the customer, you've now got this kind of semi-permeable membrane where people are selling and trading energy and energy services and ancillary services across the border. So, you know, you talk about buildings being integrated with a grid, B2G, buildings to grid, industry to grid, and V2G, ultimately vehicles to grid when we have electric vehicles. Where you have this very decentralized, all aided, of course, by digitization and intelligence being overlaid on it. You're ending up much more with that very diverse set of distributed assets, which can either provide energy, take energy, provide ancillary services, and so on into the grid. And that's a complete transformation of the way we think about electricity systems, from big central power station sends power down the cable to consumer on the end. Now you've got kind of stuff going in all directions, and that's a new world, really. That's the world we're all entering.
Yeah, I think you took words from my mouth by using the word transformation, and many people call it energy transitions, but I completely agree with you. The pace at which decentralization and of energy systems are happening, it is certainly not a transition to my mind. It really is a transformation. But there are 2-3 points that you, and I really like the point about the prosumers, what challenges it will throw up, but we'll come back to this. But let me ask you mentioned about the hybrid system that you were talking about, and also the combined heat and power, Hugh, that you have been speaking about. And I want to raise this point because would like to come back to in the latest segment about the financing and the revenue models. So Hugh, could you just tell all those who are watching us and listening to us, and let me tell you, there are more than 550 of them as we speak. What is short-term operating reserve in a bit of a technical manner? What purpose does it serve in the UK? And B, what is combined heat and power? And what could a similar thing be done in a country which is essentially very hot? So Hugh.
Yeah, you're not sitting in the UK at 48 degrees as to where you're sitting at the moment. So it's the temperatures. Well, it's the summertime. What you call it? We in the UK talk about combined heat and power. So that's basically where you put an engine in a facility, in a factory or a hospital, and you take the waste heat from the engine to produce heat. Which is what we basically need in the UK. But in the likes of India, it's slightly reversed. It works a bit like a fridge. We take the waste heat off the engine, we put it through a chiller, absorption chiller, and we get cooling system. But the net effect is the same in the sense that out of you get efficiencies as high as 88-90% efficiency out of the same quantity of fuel. So in this world today where fossil fuels are rare, then we need to be are getting rarer. Then we need to certainly be looking at smarter, cleverer ways of doing it. So that's what we originally started our business in, which was the CHP market. But as I say, in India, the absolute opportunity there is the chilling side of it. So this Ancillary Services is a kind of a godsend to us because it gives us another marketplace to play in. And going back to the point about centralization versus decentralization, you've also got the advantage on decentralizing power. You save more efficient in the sense that you're not necessarily getting the same transmission losses in moving power over long distances. In other words, you're using power where it's actually required. So there's an added advantage of the decentralization, and it gives you the flexibility and resilience, because the way we design these particular energy centres, are very, very flexible to be able to switch on and switch off. Almost within half-hour periods. So it's a really extremely important for the balancing and from a cost-effective point of view and an efficiency point of view.
Thank you. I think if I combine, you have anything else, or do we move you?
In respect to the CHP or the technical aspect of the I could talk. It depends when you want to do it, but I could talk about the sort of costs and the technical challenges of running decentralized peaking plants. But I'll be guided by you when we want to talk about that.
Okay, we'll come back to the more detailed technical parts later. But I think both of you have, if I look at what the two of you have said, leads up to very interesting options as we move ahead. Steve, you talked about prosumers, which means people who can both consume and generate power back into the grid. And Hugh, you just spoke about and explained very briefly what combined heat and power is and what it could help in India, and which is the cooling part instead of. So just for everyone else to understand what is being said, when you push 100 units of gas into a gas engine, only 40 units gets converted into electricity. 60 units is wasted as heat. So what Hugh does very, very well is to collect that heat and use it for heating in the UK. What the same thing can be done in India is to use it for cooling and also hot water. And therefore, the utilization factor increases tremendously. But most importantly, and that's where I want to come to Steve, on the same asset, which is the gas engine, we create more than one revenue streams. The first revenue stream is that of electricity that it generates. The second revenue stream is the cooling that it also provides, and the third is the hot water it gets. And therefore, suddenly, if my tariff to make that energy system or engine viable was 10 rupees to begin with, suddenly it becomes maybe half or even less, and that opens up enormous possibilities, Steve, for getting batteries in, because we continue to hear that the battery costs are very high. But can you tell us about what could be the potential use cases of a battery systems apart from the balancing, which can then create very similar revenue streams that you just spoke about?
Sure. I think there are a couple of important points in that as well. Talking about combined heat and power was about this idea of cross-vector, as it's called, say, heat, or in the case of India, cold and power, how you interact. And that in itself gives you more opportunities to provide flexibility to the grid. But in terms of stacking revenue sources, that is critical to a lot of these things, and particularly batteries. So in batteries, you could obviously, when you have prices that are very variable in the wholesale market, you can arbitrage. And in fact, in the UK and Germany, we've now seen fairly long periods of negative power, which is really interesting. If you had theoretically, if you had a big battery, whatever the technology, you could be paid to store power and then sell it when the price is positive again. You've got the ability to provide frequency response from batteries, ancillary services, and then to take output from renewables, solar, linking solar to batteries, again time shifting that power, which is critical because obviously solar generates at certain times of the day, which may be different to when you need it. So there's this whole level of services and revenue streams that get stacked on top of each other. And I think, again, because of the innovation and the change, if you're developing these kind of projects, you need to be open to identifying and valuing all of those revenue streams and securing them in a contractual form. But also we may not be in a static situation where you can fix it for 10 or 20 years. You have to accept that this is changing so rapidly. But clearly the trend is in the right direction, that these revenue streams in some form will be there. And when you're assessing the investment, you need to take a view on this revenue stack, as it's called. Make sure you get all the revenue sources that you and benefits and values, some of which will be benefits to the distribution company. So, for instance, they may not have to invest in a new cable. And how do you capture that value stream? And how do you reward the developer for it? That's an important part of how you design the market. So ideally, you want a regulatory system. And I guess we'll talk a bit about regulatory systems, but you need a regulatory system that recognizes all those value streams, where they come from, and puts in place regulations and charging mechanisms that capture them and reward the developer of these multi-asset projects, which could be battery, CHP, solar, trigen, whatever is appropriate to the particular situation.
Yeah.
So now, could I just add something?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Interestingly, how it's evolving in the UK is typically, if you look at the CHP market, we would normally look at sizing a energy facility at a factory, maybe 1 meg, 2 meg, and trying to match the power generation against the heat requirement. But what we're increasingly looking at now, and this is quite interesting from an Indian perspective, you may have a 1 megawatt electricity demand, and it may give you 1 megawatt of heat, but you may require more heat than what do you call it, electricity. So what we're looking at now in the UK is actually perhaps installing 3 or 4 megawatts at the factory, with the view that you can run the engines, you can spill some of the low cost power to the grid. But you got all the heat that you require. But then during the balancing periods, when there's a high demand, then these individual factories or facilities can actually export power to the grid. So the client who invests within his own establishment, the opportunity, because he wants his power at a good price and he wants his heat, it recovers. He has actually got an additional monetary value and revenue stream from the fact that he can actually start playing with his asset in the balancing mechanism. So actually, makes the investment in his facility more viable.
Absolutely interesting point, and thanks both Hugh and Steve for this. Hugh, Steve, let me turn to you. Many people say that regulations are needed when there is a scarcity. But normally, I mean, now even India claims to be a power surplus country. Do we still need regulations? Because you mentioned that you need some regulations to capture the monetized value of what is being avoided, whether it is a distribution upgrade. Hugh, you talked about how do we play in the power markets. So, given that Steve, India is still at the nascent stage, if I'm allowed to say, on the ancillary services market, what are your thoughts? What could we learn from what has been done in the UK, where a host of people are there in the ancillary service market?
Sure. Well, I think, let's face it, we're always going to have regulation in the electricity industry, and we should have some regulation. We talk a lot about deregulation, but actually it's re-regulation, change of regulations to encourage markets. And as we know, the UK went through that market transformation in electricity probably earlier than anybody else in the 80s and early 90s. But so the regulations that you need are about facilitating markets for all of these services. And I think increasingly they need to recognize that the real important, valuable asset is going to be flexibility. Electricity, fundamentally, if we have very cheap solar everywhere and very cheap even wind power now, we may end up with a surplus of power, effectively. And that's a strange kind of change of mentality, because we all grew up with the history of the oil crisis in the 70s, and energy's in short supply. And maybe it's not in short supply, but in that scenario, what becomes short supply is flexibility in the system. And so regulators need to think about designing the market to get the best economic outcome to provide the flexibility. And that's hard for regulators who've kind of grown up in the electricity industry, whichever country they're in. They come from that sector, and the electricity industry has been based on big centralized units, and that sort of linkage between electricity, big plants, and modernism is still kind of ingrained in the industry and in us to a certain extent, those of us who grew up in that period. But you need regulators to take a different view and think about how do you incentivize the flexibility, which is what's really needed, and the decarbonization, of course. And those things, and I'm not a market design expert or an expert on auctions, but clearly some kind of price discovery and competitive decentralized approach would give you, I think, a better answer than the old central big power does this to you kind of approach. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think that's what I'm saying. Market-driven approach is the way to go.
No, certainly it does. So what I take out of from what you said is that the steel frame, and the bureaucracy in India is also called the steel frame, needs to be more flexible than it has been, particularly the power sector bureaucracy in the regulations. So let me turn to you. What changes you recommend for India based on the various international markets that you have worked on, particularly the gas-based ancillary services? What is the kind of innovative changes in policies, and how quickly do you think it's something that needs to be now order of the day if you really want to have balancing as a service? Because as Steve rightly said, the UK is the ancillary services itself is in short supply. So over to you.
Yeah, I can reflect on what Stephen says, is that we need to have that flexibility in the marketplace in order to bring in the entrepreneurs and the investors and the developers and the opportunists to come along, and especially in India, to see that it's not a case of a centralized system, nationalized system, whereby you're very much the grid. It's about working in partnership with between government and industry to give the country what it needs, and that requires a flexibility and an opportunity. Because let's face it, everybody's in business to make money and to try and make a profit. So you basically have to create that mechanism. You have to create that market, and it's got huge benefits, not only to the stability of the grid, but it's got, as Stephen rightly mentioned, it's got massive benefits from a cost point of view, because what we have found over the years is the price, it's like the price of wind and solar was very, very expensive. Over years, by introducing more and more players and more, what do you call it, competition, the overall price of renewables has come down considerably. So the overall control of the price in India, if you actually had that flexibility for people, because when I, for example, I compete with, I can name 5 or 6 major, we're one of the major companies. There's 3 or 4 other companies who play in this auxiliary market from an engine point of view. And because of the high competition and because of our flexibility and our access to the grid, it deliberately drives the prices down. So our margins are not, high, but the consumer benefits from the power coming in at a reasonable price. So it goes without saying, everybody has to work in partnership together, and there has to be an opening up of the regulations and the flexibility.
Excellent point, Hugh. And let me come to you, Steve. Just with a flavor of what the Indian power market looks like. Indian power market, 90% is tied up on long-term power purchase agreements, which is basically not marketable. Just about 5% of power is traded on Indian markets. Number 2, the long-term power purchase agreements have a fixed cost which is derived out of the cost plus system. And just as you said, if you do a competitive discovery of prices, whether it is of the variable cost or the fixed cost, the competition ensures the best possible cost, and ultimate beneficiary is the consumer. Steve, tell me about the UK store auctions and how, I mean, given that India is now thinking of creating an ancillary service market, should we go the way we went to create the market that exists in power, which is inefficient, but also it was the need of the hour 30 years ago. But having learned all the lessons from around the world, Steve, if you could just highlight how these services are procured in the UK, and what is your recommendation for the Indian regulators?
Sure. Well, I think the price discovery and auction approach has proven to work. It's worked very well in renewables where it's been done, and it's worked well in markets like store, the short-term operating reserve that we're talking about. So we've seen the price of store capacity fall, I think, which obviously limits the market. There's a natural balance that happens there as more and more entrants have come on, and then that's also driven the innovation, say people starting to look at batteries and so on, and other ways of providing the service through demand response batteries or hybrid systems. So the auction approach and real market approach ultimately, I think, has to be the best approach. I think all markets, not just India, but all markets, regulators kind of lag behind the market. That's just the reality of life. There's innovation and regulation rushes to catch up. I think the UK is a good example to study, but as I would say in everything, you also need to learn from things that have not worked so well in the UK, and perhaps leapfrog over the UK to much more of a market approach. And you do also need to build in this flexibility because the situation is changing so quickly. As I said earlier, we've had to kind of invent new services on the hoof, or National Grid has invented new services to cope with the current situation. And the current situation is like a foretaste of what's happening. But ultimately, auctions, competition, private markets have been proven to drive costs down. And as long as you incentivize the decarbonisation, which I think is inherent as well, you'll get a better result overall.
Thanks, Steve. Steve indicated a very important point, which is not just applicable in what we are discussing today, but on a host of other things. the early movers like the UK have not just gone through successes, but there have been setbacks in the journey as well. What are the 2 or 3 things you, in your opinion, could have been done better in hindsight? Something that India can learn and not repeat those mistakes, and with people like you and Steve with us in this endeavor, we could actually provide a much better model to the Indian regulators.
I think, as I say, it was kind of invented back in 2014, 15 when we were looking at these individual standby power generation, and then there was the auction side of it. When the auctions first came out, the auction prices were relatively high. This is where you bid in your particular plant, and you got a price for what do you call it, for being available, for being there in the first place. So that was your kind of capacity market contracts that you got. You got a payment for the capacity. A few people get into that side of it. Now, the capacity, they get payment in the auctions from the capacity is to basically go towards the investment in these type of projects. And it was relatively high. Over the years, it's come down, and I think, Steve, correct me wrong, it was as low as £6 or £6. It started about £24, £25 a megawatt. What do you call it? Down to about £6 or £7. Now, that scared the market for investing in these projects, because the other thing is there is no certainty as to where anybody investing in these decentralized plants. There's no certainty in the UK as to how many hours you're going to operate. Typically, one of our plants will run anything between 13 to 1,500 hours per annum. Now, bear in mind there's 8,760 hours in the panel, but there's never always a guarantee, what do you call it, on those hours run. So the capacity market and the government's intervention in creating the capacity market gave an amount of guaranteed cash in the form of a standby. What I think has happened now is that, what do you call it, there's a sort of breaks on it almost after 4 or 5 years, because the prices got so low that there's 4 or 5 major players are staying in the market in order to capture. There's a view that show this capacity market go to 1,300 hours, 1,500 hours, 1,700 hours, 2,000 hours in a year. And what do you call it? So the marketplace is, it's fickle, but it will find a balance, and it will have actually settled down into what's comfortable. But also, the interesting thing is you have to be careful when you're only. One of the issues that I have with my particular plant is that they don't no equipment likes to be on, off. I mean, gas engines, by their very design and nature, are designed to run 93% of the time. And what we have found over the last 5 or 6 years is that you have to change your mentality on engineering and the technical aspect of maintaining this type of equipment, because it goes hot, it goes cold, it goes hot, it goes cold, it's running for 3 hours, it's not running for 2 days, it runs another 3 hours. So we have actually had to learn an awful lot over the years, but we've already learned those lessons. And it's a lesson, this is where some of the sharing of the expertise and the sharing of the knowledge with the likes of India is that we've been there, got the T-shirt. We can be 3 jumps, 4 jumps ahead when you start to develop this market in India, because this is an experience that's we're living through for the last 4 or 5 years. So what do you call it? When you do make the changes and when you do start to change the legislation in India, then there's a lot of experience already established in how to play in this type of market. But it's a market that's going to come to India no matter what. You've no choice. It will happen,
Wonderful, you. I think you summed it up and maybe made my life and job easier. There is no choice. This is coming, and we have to brace up for it. Of course, the experience that you guys have, both from the policy and regulatory part, and also the technical side that you mentioned, that it's all about changing the way you have to maintain an engine which goes on and off. And I'm sure the same thing applies to batteries as well. So, gentlemen, while you stay on, let me also welcome another special guest that will join us in this part of the segment, Dr. Nikit Abhyankar. Dr. Abhyankar is a senior fellow in Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. He's an international expert on energy systems, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and also has been very, very effectively working with the Government of India, Ministry of Power, Ministry of Renewable Energy, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and many new ideas and programs has been developed with Nikit's assistance. Welcome, Nikit, to this program. And let me give you a few minutes, if you can. You've heard the discussion that is going on, and the end conclusion of this, which you very rightly puts up. The time is now, and it is now. I mean, we can't afford to wait. So what would you suggest to the Power Ministry and the central regulator as to what are the 3-4 steps that need to be taken based on what your experience is and what you just heard today?
Excellent. Thank you very much. I completely agree that this is the right time and we should strike when the iron is hot on several aspects. So overall, I can just very briefly talk about where I see ancillary services market fitting into the broader kind of electricity markets. So overall, we have energy markets, day ahead, real time, ancillary capacity markets, and so on and so forth. So one really has to look at all the aspects of electricity markets in an integrated fashion instead of just looking at ancillary or real time and so on. So for example, as India is advancing towards more efficient and more liquid real-time markets, then the role of ancillary services markets also needs to be assessed that's number one. Number two, interestingly, gas engines and batteries have been mentioned. I can just quickly cite some experience from the US. If you look at the US ancillary services market, most of the current revenue streams for the battery system operators in the US actually comes from ancillary services. And also many of the gas combustion turbine or gas engine operators, most of their current revenue stream actually comes from ancillary services markets. And why does that happen is because the reliability standard is extremely high. So ancillary services market and the revenues and the prices that one can see in ancillary services market is intricately tied with the reliability standards that the distribution utilities or the transmission utilities have. So that's why while ancillary services market is being set up, the reliability standards need to be strengthened up in general. Thirdly, the regulatory framework has to be significantly strengthened. Who decides the ancillary services requirement, who procures them, how are they compensated, how are they settled, and so on and so forth. And this kind of leads me to the last part of my remarks, on which I would also pose some questions to the panelists here. We have talked about gas engines, other gas assets, batteries. What kind of ancillary services can demand-side resources provide? Because India, obviously, we all know, I mean, ESL better than anybody else, this humongous potential on demand-side resources, both in terms of increasing space cooling load, agricultural load is already providing some level of demand response support. So what kind of ancillary services can this huge demand-side resource provide? And I would love, Steve and you to comment on that. That's number one. Number two is, given that renewable energy costs very, very rapidly, can renewable energy projects offer some ancillary service support as well? I mean, essentially, instead of curtailing that renewable energy, can they offer some cost-effective ancillary support? That's question number two. And question number three is, did the regulatory framework evolve? Obviously, it did not start overnight. How did it evolve over time? And I think I'll stop here and then maybe we can discuss later.
Thanks, Dr. Bianca. And I think the very interesting point, and thank you very much for your very good and insightful comment. Steve, the first point, and we have a large number of questions coming up. I'll come to them in a minute. But I think Dr. Bianca touched upon an issue which we all faced over the last 2 years, demand response versus ancillary services. Your thoughts on this, and maybe if you also want to come in.
Sure. Well, I think thanks for the questions, Nick. I think demand response and the demand side has a huge role to play, as you said, and we see that here in the UK, where demand response provides effectively frequency response and plays into that market. And then what we've had is a sort of development of the aggregator model, similar to in the US, where each individual project in a building or a factory is quite small. But when you can aggregate lots of them together using remote sensing and monitoring in real time, then you can play that capacity over, which is both very distributed into very small units and distributed geographically. You can play that into the frequency response market. So we are seeing that, and demand response, as we know, there is huge potential in almost any building almost that you could turn things off for a while without noticing. In industry, some extra demand that you can turn off. Clearly, some things you can't turn off, but that sort of demand response potential is huge in all sectors, and I think in all countries. And we're starting to grow that market here and in the US and in other markets around the world.
So there you need both side by side. So Hugh, let me turn to the next question to you, and this is from Dr. Ian Campbell, and we'll come back to Nikit's other questions because some of them will be tied up. In fact, the second one is something like that. Dr. Ian Campbell from the Rocky Mountain Institute says, can there be a diversity of renewable energy sources so that the requirement of ancillary services itself goes down? Something very similar to Dr. Nikit. What is your opinion? And second thing that he asked, given that India is a hot country and the cooling load is only going to rise in future, something that Dr. Bianca also, what could be the potential solutions? And you in your talk mentioned about tri-generation in India. Could you just touch upon these 2-3 points which are there?
Yeah, I think I used the word earlier in our discussions when I talked about hybrid systems. We're increasingly being asked, by companies to look at, everybody wants to be green, everybody wants to use green energy and solar, etc. But at the end of the day, power is always about resilience. It's always having the ability to power there. And we talked earlier about wind power and solar power not necessarily always being, available. So you then have to start looking at a combination, and this is where I'm saying you get this whole sort of idea of a mishmash and a mix of facilities and a hybrid system. So, for example, we talked about I remember going to somebody that says, I want to use green power, but by the same token, I know it's not always as reliable. So I want you guys to set up your facility behind the hedge in the factory over in the corner so we don't see you. So everybody sees the solar panels, everybody sees our wind turbines and we're renewable. But at the end of the day, I don't want my factory not to have power. So you have to then sort of think to yourself, okay, then, well, we'll be in the background where the renewables, aren't efficient enough and the gas engines there as a standby. It was mentioned earlier about the role of renewables in this market. And Stephen mentioned earlier about the word that he used, the expression time shifting. And that is about, when solar or wind is on full flow and the demand is low in the grid, then the renewables is used to charge the batteries, which in turn are there for the backup for the frequency. And at the same time, you've got your resilience and your guarantee through your gas engine. So that whole combination, the renewables in the side of it, the resilience, the availability, the guaranteed availability is all absolutely critical. So there's not one thing, there's not one solution fits all. You can get wonderful flexibility and wonderful resistance and wonderful guarantees and huge cost savings if you start to be a wee bit innovative and look at a hybrid solution with a wee bit of everything, a good mix. Yeah.
And if I can add something to that, I think it's about this other piece of jargon that seems to have appeared, this kind of cross vector where heat and electricity, or in the case of India, cold, which is only less heat, of course, technically. So in Denmark and other places, we're seeing district heating schemes with solar and electric heating up thermal storage, and then using electricity when it's cheap and providing flexibility to the electricity system. Heating system is providing flexibility to the electricity system. And we're seeing some of that in the UK with thermal storage systems coming out in the residential market. And you can see that same model being used for cooling. There's no difference between cooling and heat. So this kind of cross-vector idea is also important.
Okay, so let me let me return the compliment to Dr. Nikita Bianca by asking him a question which has just come up from Shashank Shekhar. It's and I'll just read it out. Given India's imminent renewable ambition, what are the realistic timelines for the application of ancillary services in India? Number two, how else can we prepare the grid for RE injection? Dr. Bianca, you have been a great student of Indian energy systems. Your response.
I'll try. So, in terms of the timeline for ancillary services, I mean, the short, but the long answer is a little more nuanced, because to set up a more efficient and functioning ancillary services, you really need a good real-time settlement mechanism. And India is just moving into more real-time energy markets. So once the real-time energy market is set up, and then one can really move on to the ancillary market. And then again, to set up an efficient ancillary market, one has to have a significant regulatory framework in place. The system operator has to procure, and so on and so forth. So overall, we are looking at a few years from now for a fully functional ancillary market. And the good news is that both the system operators and the regulators are moving very fast in that direction, and things are going pretty well. That's number one. Number two, in terms of what actions or what steps one can take for RE injection into the grid, three bullets: flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. So there is absolutely no recourse from there. And flexibility can be offered by multiple resources: demand side, gas, of course, hydro, batteries, and so on and so forth. And there are significant efforts underway on that as well. But I think an interesting thing that India can be kind of a torchbearer of using demand side resources for renewable integration is with agricultural load shifting. And Karnataka is an amazingly successful state where they have shifted nearly 3,000 megawatts of agricultural load from nighttime to daytime during solar hours. And that way, the state, with the peak load of 10 gigawatts, can integrate solar capacity of 7 gigawatts. So there are several such solutions.
Yeah, Dr. Bianca, I think that's a very important point you made, and maybe we should, at some point in time in near future, discuss this very interesting aspect of how Karnataka did it. What does it hold for the other states? But having said that, we have just 4 minutes left, and let me tell the three of our guests that each one of you have brought about 600 people who are listening to us. Unfortunately, because I was present, 200 have dropped out. So we have more than 1,500 people who are currently either live or they have been coming in and out of this conversation. And let me take the last question, which I will request both Steve and you to answer. And the question comes from Rahul. What, according to you, are the two key regulations or regulatory recommendations from UK that you would recommend to India? Steve, first you, and then you, and maybe Nikit, you could add from your international experience.
Well, just to name two, that's a hard one. I think it is about one. It's about creating regulations that enable the market, which, as Nick has said, requires a real-time energy market with the ancillary service. But I'd just say a market approach to ancillary services without going into the details.
So which means you should have good accounting, good scheduling practice on a real-time basis, and good settlement mechanism. Is that what you're
exactly? You need all of that. Those are all enabling conditions to get to a market. But India is extremely capable in those kind of areas, so I don't see any problem doing it. Just requires the push from the top and the regulations.
Hugh?
Yeah, it's about the ability to be able to trade freely with the power, and also from a technical point of view, for the regulations to allow people to connect into the networks and have access to the distribution of the power. Because it's all very well producing power decentralized, but you have to get it to your customers. So there's clearly some regulations on the distribution and transportation of power and what do you call it? Obviously the revenue stream from that, you know.
Okay, Dr. Bianca, I have just one more question left, and possibly the time for just one more question. I mean, there are many questions, more than 1,600 people. So what we will possibly do is that all questions that our experts are unable to take because of the lack of time, we will try and call out and reach out to these experts again and have the answers, and we'll post it on our websites and on the. So there's one last question, Dr. Bianca, from Akshay. It says, can we use second life batteries? Or I presume what he's talking about is batteries which cannot be used for transportation for ancillary services.
No, I think that's a great point, and that's definitely an emerging area of application. But applications, when the battery reaches 80% of its rated capacity, it is just checked out of utilization, and that's great potential for extending its life and using for ancillary services. There are several problems though, because you just need bigger batteries for power sector applications, and transport batteries are much smaller. Connecting multiple batteries together creates some technical issues. So there are technical issues, but there is potential there for extending their life.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Stephen Fox, Mr. Hugh Richmond, and Dr. Nikita Bianca. I think this was very, very invigorating, very enriching for me, and I'm sure for almost 1,600 or more people who tuned in today. I think this was perhaps the most tuned in webinar that ESL hosted on its platform. So let me also thank Dr. Nikita Bianca for joining in. I know it's very early morning in Berkeley that you are staying, but many, many thanks for taking out time. Many thanks, Hugh and Dr. Steve. And let me thank each and every one who joined us during this conversation. It has been really wonderful to talk to our experts, and we'll meet again very, very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.